Just a couple of announcements. Is anybody having trouble seeing this morning? Well, if you are, I've got your glasses. Anybody lose their glasses in here last night or yesterday before you left? We have them up here at the podium, so be sure to pick them up. Doesn't have any name on it, but just come by if you lost your eyeglasses. Also, just one announcement before we turn the podium over to our speaker for this morning. Please don't forget the VSI Executive Management Conference that will be in Lynchburg on June the 12th and the 13th. It's a very good conference for your chief deputy or someone in your executive staff to attend. The cutoff date for that is in about 2 weeks. So please sign up for that. Very good comments from those meetings in the past. So if you have a chief deputy or someone in your executive staff you'd like to send, please sign up for that. Okay, it's my honor to call Mr. Adam Lee, who is the Vice President and Chief Security Officer for Corporate Intelligence and Security for Dominion Energy Services, to the stand.
Thanks, Sheriff Taylor, and congratulations on your new reign. And before I begin, I do want to say congratulations, too, for Carl Leonard's term overseeing your organization. Carl and I worked closely together when I was a special agent in charge of the FBI's Richmond Division years ago. And his leadership was amazing in terms of recognizing that sheriffs in their position have an opportunity, placement, and access to assist the larger national security mission of the FBI. And that was new to me in my region there, to have that kind of leadership from his department. And that was absolutely a fantastic partnership. So, Sheriff Leonard, thank you for that. So good morning, everyone. For those I don't know, I know a few of you. It feels like home coming and speaking to you after a career, 30 years in government, county, state, and federal government, now living in the corporate world, which will probably befall some of you at some point in your future careers. It's my last private sector job before landing at Dominion was working in California at a grocery store while I was in college. So it's been an interesting transition, sort of culturally, going from a law enforcement career and the mindset of a law enforcement officer all the way through to an executive in the business to corporate life, where things are just sort of the emergency definition is a very different one in corporate life. But for this audience, I think it would be useful in our brief time together here to talk about the threats that we face as critical infrastructure and how that intersects with your mission out in the field and your deputies and what they're doing in and around substations, in and around large transmission facilities, in and around solar facilities and the other things that Dominion Energy has in your communities. Back in 2013, there was out in California, PG&E's territory out there, an attack on a substation that sort of woke our industry up. It woke the FBI up, and certainly engaged, I think, law enforcement more in protection of national critical infrastructure. And that attack was a Metcalf substation. Some of you have probably seen that in in-services and other things, because it's really become it's a case that was never solved, and it involved a coordinated attack on a smaller substation that was a distribution substation out in California. And the attack has a level of sophistication in that the shooters, they were sniper shots coming from different directions. The shooters knew where to hit on the mechanisms, the transformers and their cooling systems and things within the sort of fenced area of the substation. and didn't waste a lot of time on the bigger, more obvious targets. So it wasn't target practice. It wasn't an attractive nuisance kind of shooting, or we've seen these Tannerite sort of events here in Virginia, things that they're blowing up things that are the obvious things in a substation you'd want to blow up, which oftentimes are not the things of critical importance to delivering energy. Sometimes they're just big, obvious things. In the case of Metcalf, they were shooting areas of the substation that really took it out and made it and caused millions of dollars in damage because they were hitting critical areas of the substation. I think there's some expectation through the investigation that it was an insider who knew, but either way, sort of the chronicling of that event became sort of a guidebook for folks that we're now seeing in the Pacific Northwest. We're seeing them here. We're seeing them, I think, most recently in North Carolina, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But folks are now seeing that as a good way to make their statement politically, and there's sort of online, there's guides on subversive websites and other places on how to do it and cause real damage to substations out there. The transmission business, the big, large lines, the big towers, that's a separate business for us, and that's all regulated by federal regulators. The North American Electrical Reliability Corporation is sort of the quasi-government regulatory body that informs the Federal Energy Commission and the Department of Energy on the latest things that our industry has to do to secure itself. And when you see those large transmission lines, there's so much security around those. We're using AI-enabled cameras, some of which cost $100,000 a piece. We have over 10,000 of those cameras deployed across our transmission business. The fencing, the motion detection, we're now deploying robotic systems, drones, submersibles in the case of our offshore wind project, and all of those things are driven by compliance standards that we're accountable to meet in critical infrastructure. The things that give us the most concern in terms of what we're seeing in communities right now are those attacks on the much smaller substations in our distribution business, the things that are really vulnerable and the things that are almost cost prohibitive in terms of building those kinds of protections around them so that threat actors can't get to them and take them down. And we saw that in Moore County. So Moore County was, there were two stations near to each other. I think the investigation has identified the folks who conducted those attacks. They were part of a subversive group that was looking to do damage and cause the kinds of political outcomes that they talk about in their web traffic. It never works, but they continue to do it. But they hit on areas in the substation. You know, you would think the large transformers are the things that if you're taking a target practice, you would be aiming at sort of the big cylindrical thing. But what they hit in those cases were the cooling mechanisms under them, which is a small radiator that lines underneath, and they hit those things very strategically. It gave them the opportunity to let the cooling oil drain out of the transformer, give them about an hour to get away before it overheated and exploded and caused the blackouts to their customers. It was a Duke Energy facility. So that's what, when you're out and you're at stand-up or you're doing roll call and you're talking about threat issues, the guy from Dominion wants you to know that what we're looking for in those attacks, and we see our stuff gets shot up all the time. We see the Tannerite, that was a big issue for a few years. But what we're looking for is some degree of sophistication, and that's the kind of thing we want that information to move very quickly. That if they're not shooting at the big obvious targets, but they're trying to hit control systems, or trying to hit cooling systems, or trying to hit that kind of thing, that's the information that's available to these groups on the internet right now. And that usually means an affiliation with some kind of a politically oriented group. Up in the Pacific Northwest, you know, the Moore County got national news. It was a big story. It's impacting policy at the federal level in terms of what our industry has to do to strengthen the defenses around those more remote substations, and we have thousands of them. But Pacific Northwest, the radical environmental extremist groups, the anarchists, we've recently had substation attacks by people just trying to create subterfuge while they were committing a robbery over here, right? That's the classic look over there while they're doing something over here tactic. They have that all the time. It's remarkable. You know, we are so used to effective policing here. We are so used to sort of corporate stewardship and responsibility here in the Mid-Atlantic and in the Commonwealth of Virginia, to be sure. Up in the Pacific Northwest, and a colleague of mine, a very close colleague, 20-year friend of mine, is now the CSO of Portland General Electric. And he said that he's had 11 attacks since last summer on substations, to include people breaking in and smashing their control systems with hammers. And they're virtually all anarchist groups or the radical environmental extremists. So we have it pretty good here, and that's thanks to you and the work that you do. I think Dominion Energy's relationship with law enforcement and with local government is second to none. We have a full-time detail lead of the Fusion Center run by state police there in the Richmond area. We provide threat briefings to the law enforcement agencies of concern when we have anything that impacts our communities, and we'll continue to do that. If your agencies want to build and strengthen that and get a better flow of information from us, just reach out to me. My contact information will be available to you. Call me directly, please, and we will make sure that if there's threat briefings and that sort of thing that you're interested in, even if it's just to prepare you to talk to the community. I know all of you are leaders. I can help with that, so please reach out. We can help inform some of those discussions for you if that's useful to you. As the CSO, the things that keep me up at night, I think it's useful for you folks, again, as leaders, to understand your energy company and the downstream impact of a major outage or major attack is something that you want to be aware of, particularly when you talk to your local civic leaders and the people that you serve, your constituents. The cyber attacks in our industry are the most pernicious sort of security obstacle we face. And that's because the amount of damage you can do if you're able to compromise a SCADA system, that, you know, the control systems that manage either our gas distribution pipelines, electric transmission. It's the physical vulnerability of a major transmission station, as I mentioned, is not the biggest concern because they are fortified. They're very well defended physically. But one effective cyber attack by a sophisticated actor could create the kinds of things that you saw with Colonial Pipeline not that long ago. We're a very similar analog business to Colonial Pipeline. We are an industrial control business, right? So all of the digitizing of the grid that you're reading about creates vectors of vulnerability for Russia, China, Iran, North Korea to do damage to critical infrastructure in the United States. And they are right now, as we hear the rain on the roof, that is about the number of attacks that we get on the outer perimeter of our network. The automated tools of nation states are on the outer perimeter of our attack in numbers of about 3 billion a month. So defending those attacks is where most of our investment in security is at Dominion Energy, and there's a good reason for that. You can't build compliance strategies to manage the Russian GRU sandworm group, who's attacking right now, as we speak, the Ukrainian grid and critical infrastructure with great success. They did it in 2015, they did it in 2016, and they took the grid down and blacked out entire cities in Ukraine. They're doing that right now, and we're learning from it. NSA is on the ground. All the folks that you would expect and hope are there studying those attacks. and then informing critical infrastructure. We have those relationships, and those things are happening right now. But if there were a successful Colonial Pipeline type ransomware attack on Dominion Energy that ends up causing blackouts, brownouts, things, those are going to impact your communities. And the response is going to be something like a major storm outage or something like that. And so I think it's useful for you as leaders to be at least conversant on those issues, because in the event we had an attack that caused that kind of kinetic outcome, whether it's an outage or some kind of an overheating, overloading of a distribution gas pipeline, which is an awful thing to think about, we have adversaries that are trying to do that right now as we speak. So just as you understand the threat landscape attending critical infrastructure, attending your gas and your electric grids, I think it's smart to just be able to talk to your leaders about what's at stake and what's actually happening, not just in our networks, but also around the world, causing quite a bit of law enforcement concern, of course. So those are the things I really wanted to talk about. If anyone has any questions, I know I only have 30 minutes with you this morning, and I know you're at the end of your conference. I do want to take just a minute to say, as a former FBI executive, I can't tell you how much I appreciated the partnership when I was in the agency. If anyone wants to talk about what's happening with the FBI, that's going to cost you a cocktail or two. But you know, we're chatting before my comments here today, and please understand that there is still a bright line separation between the core field work of the FBI and what happens in Washington, D.C. And the agents are still on the ground. They're still preserving retirement funds. They're still disrupting transnational organized crime. They're still responding to bank robberies. They're still catching kidnappers and rescuing the kidnapped victims, child exploitation, all the things that the FBI does, they're still doing that. So that's my quick pitch to a bunch of stakeholders in terms of what that resource is. So please don't hold the line folks out in the field doing the hard work responsible for what you're reading about in Washington, D.C. Does anyone have any questions? I'd be more than happy to answer them. Again, we are out in the field with you. We want to partner with you. We appreciate what you do. We appreciate the challenges you face. And if there's anything we can do as Dominion Energy to support you, we're here for you. One thing that did occur to me that's kind of a hot issue right now, and a lot of you, all services, sheriffs have investigative responsibility and use poll cams. I don't know if that's an issue that you guys are talking. It's really impacting certainly the municipal police departments and federal agencies. Surveillance, static surveillance deployments. You're using our easements, right? You're using our electric poles. You're using telecommunications and that sort of thing. There's been a shift in the law around that, and a lot of companies are just sort of looking at the quick liability risk of the use of poll cams. I have worked with our general counsel to continue to have at my level approval authority to deploy poll cams. Many electric businesses have just said we're not doing it because of the liability, because now companies are being held liable if there's a Fourth Amendment violation by a law enforcement agency deploying a poll cam. So we're still in the game with you. If that changes, it's because of court cases and things that are holding companies responsible, and I think we're right at the precipice of one bad court case, and we're probably going to be out two, which is enormously frustrating to me. But the trajectory of that has been caused by agencies not in Virginia that have misplaced poll cams so they could see in windows, they could see down into protected areas, into Fourth Amendment protected areas, and they've done it deliberately, and they've been able to show that. So the electric businesses, usually it's unusual, I think, for when those things are deployed for their, the company's field folks to assess it and do a Fourth Amendment scrub on it. That almost never happens. So we're entirely reliant on you and your field folks to deploy these things appropriately. And I think companies are starting to lose an appetite for that trust because of some of the directions of those court cases. So if that's an area of conversation you'd like to have, please call me. But I know that's a really big issue for a lot of folks. We deploy hundreds of them between Virginia and South Carolina where we have infrastructure. So if it hasn't hit you yet, it's something that will if you guys have investigative responsibility in your agencies. That's what I got.
Any questions for Mr. Lee?
Must be the end of the conference or something.
What kind of rifle do you use? What systems do snipers use? And how to set up?
I don't know. That's a great question. I know the one that we responded to was just an AR. That was the one down in South North Carolina, and my folks responded to that, and we were involved in that investigation. I assume that the Moore County ones were also, sport rifles. I don't think they were sophisticated sniper weapons. I think the ones out in Metcalf's were like 308s. So those, yeah, those they actually call that a true sniper attack out in Metcalf. Yeah. Anything else, guys? Well, enjoy the very short remainder of your conference. Please do reach out to me if there's anything I can do to you. We do produce some pretty impressive intelligence products. I've built that capability at Dominion. I have a director-led intelligence component. We're not a classified environment, so if we're doing research on this stuff, we can share it with you. And as stakeholders, I'm more than happy to do that with you and your agencies. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your conference, guys. No, I won't. Thank you. Yes.
I might add that when Mr. Lee was in Richmond at the Richmond office, each time we called his office, we got a return call within that day. So he was very receptive to local law enforcement. We really appreciate his efforts. His region helped us many, many times over the years. I'll announce again before the next speaker comes up, we've got just a couple of minutes. Anybody who's missing their glasses, I know some came in a little bit later after we started. We have a pair of glasses that somebody left in the room last night. So if you need those, we have them up here on the desk. She's here. Our next speaker goes without any recognition, of course. Robin. Oh, she's getting set back there. Robin DeSocio from the Comp Board is coming to bring us great news this morning. I know it's going to be plenty of money. Yeah, if you don't, please grab a Harris bag so we can load up before she leaves.
We'll give it over to alphabetical order, start with Accomack County.
Oh, I think I see her going out of the back door now. So, Robin, anytime you're ready, we're ready for the great news. While Robin is coming up, we want to recognize those sheriffs that maybe this is their last year in their term and they're not going to run again. For those of us or those in the audience that this is their last year in their term, would you please stand? Let us recognize you for your years of service. Thank you, guys. We will miss your influence and your experience, but Godspeed to you. And now I'm going to ask Robin if she'll come up and bring the glad tidings. You do have glad tidings.
Mike, are these yours? Okay. Well, good morning. Is there a clicker for the slides?
This,
No, the clicker for the slides.
this right here,
Okay.
right there.
Okay, my apologies for delaying here a little bit. I was trying to get my notes printed and apparently there was a problem. So I'm just gonna like ad hoc here for a little bit. And I don't have a lot of slides, I'm sorry. I have a couple things up here that I wanted to be able to go over with you. But I won't be running through a whole ton of slides. But good morning, and thank you all for having me here today. I've been asked to speak with you all a little bit about the budget, the compensation board. So where I don't usually read my notes, but I usually do have them. So where we usually kick this off every year is just kind of talk a little bit about where we are with the budget process, what's going on in the compensation board budget, and what things look like this year. So as you all know, and as we talked about last year, when the legislature adjourned last year, we didn't have a budget. And so we're in a little bit of a different situation this year. It seems like over the course of the last probably 10 or 12 years, we have more and more found that the legislature can't always complete its work on time. But it seems like every time that they don't come to a budget agreement, it's done in a little bit of a different form. So most years we've had to put off our setting of the budgets. This particular year, the legislature actually did approve a budget. So the governor introduced his budget in December. There were a number of items on there related to funding for sheriff's offices. And then moving forward to the legislature, there were a number of amendments on the House side, on the Senate side, that did make some changes to that budget. But what happened this year, again, we reached a point where the legislature was not able to complete its work on time. There is a conference committee for the budget that reconciles the budgets between the House and the Senate and comes up with an agreement. They were not able to do that on time this year, and so what they instead approved was what they called a skinny budget. Sharon, can I have that water? I apologize. So they approved this year what they called a skinny budget. So they essentially, let me back up a little bit. The Commonwealth has a 2-year budget. Even though the Compensation Board sets budgets for all of the constitutional officers annually, the Commonwealth itself has a 2-year budget process. So, and those of you who work with your association and with the legislature know we have a long session and a short session. So essentially what happens in a long session is the Commonwealth adopts a 2-year budget that covers a 2-year time period. And then on the short session years, which is the odd years, they establish just amendments to the budget that already exists. So that's why we have a short session. So as the legislature was getting ready to adjourn, they said, well, we already have a budget because the budget was approved last year. And it provided for fiscal year 23 and fiscal year 24, and all of the work that was being done during the legislative cycle or during the legislative session was to approve amendments to that existing budget. So when we got to the end of the session and the budget conference committee members, which are the individuals selected from the House and Senate to come together and negotiate on the differences in the budgets, when we got to kind of the end of the timeline for that, they were not able to come to agreement on time. They said, well, we already have a budget, so they approved what's called a skinny budget. And that was essentially everything that was already in the budget for fiscal year '24, and they just added a few things that were pertinent to the Commonwealth, rainy day fund adjustment, some funding for VRS, just really a very narrow set of items, nothing that pertained to the compensation board or funding for constitutional officers. So where we are, but what's new this year, for the first time, is that they actually adopted a budget without taking any action on any of the amendments. And so because we have a budget, we move forward with our process. So there are, unfortunately, only a few things in that budget that we're working on right now. And those are, Susan has something for me. Thank you. Give me just a second to kind of figure out where I am. So at this time, the only changes to new budgets for fiscal year '24 are going to be based on funding that was already approved. And there were three things. The Compensation Board has approved 5% across the board increases effective July 1st. That's something that the 2022 legislature approved. They approved the 5% for last year and the 5% for this year. So that 5% across the board salary increase is already in play. Two other things that we will be able to deal with during the course of this is a little bit of funding for the career development program and the reallocation of emergency corrections positions. So one thing I will mention, and I'll get to it a little bit further, is that the budget conference committee members, when they passed that skinny budget, they did indicate that they intended to continue to work toward negotiating a budget agreement. So all of the items that were proposed by the governor, that were proposed by the House and the Senate, those things are not necessarily, gone by the wayside at this point. They have said that they will continue to negotiate, but because we have a budget, we have to move forward with what we have. So again, the 5% increase across the board for all positions. And this one particular increase, please keep in mind that your local government does have to pass those funds along to your employees in the form of a pay raise. So if your locality is doing 7%, 6%, 5%, they're probably already working on making those decisions. That covers the 5% that we're providing. So they have to make sure that when we provide the 5% increase, that they're not just absorbing that through your local supplement and not passing along a salary increase to your employees. So that is one of the things that will go forward. It was in the budget, it's still in the budget, and we're working on moving that forward. As I mentioned, the other two funding changes that you'll see in budgets at this time is the reallocation of emergency corrections positions, as well as some career development program funding. So the emergency corrections positions are reallocated annually, and it's based upon the inmate populations in the jails, where the inmate populations have declined, where other jails have populations that are still overcrowded. So we've seen some pretty significant and sustained reductions in jail populations over the course of the last couple of years. Part of that, obviously starting with the pandemic and a lot of folks leaving the jails or courts not putting people in jail. But also, those of you that have jails know that the Department of Corrections since last summer has started significantly pulling out their state responsible inmates from the jails. So for years, for decades really, we've had large populations of what we call out of compliance inmates in the jails. Those are state responsible inmates that are overdue for transfer to the Department of Corrections. I'm trying to think, the highest numbers that I've seen in the last 20 years have probably been over 6,000 just out of compliance state responsible inmates in the jails. As of the last several weeks, Department of Corrections numbers of out of compliance inmates in jails has been fluctuating between 200 and 300, numbers that I've never seen in the decades that I've been with the Compensation Board. So you still have your, your individuals who are sentenced to state responsible time, and in that first 60 days, they're not considered overdue, so they're not considered out of compliance. So we still obviously have that population of state responsible inmates in the jails, but the out of compliance numbers have dropped from, a point in time when they were well over to 6,000 to around 200 right now. They've been holding pretty steady at those levels for the last several months. There's some thought maybe those numbers will start to go up, but we haven't seen that happen yet. Now, so again, some jails have seen some pretty significant, pretty sustained reductions in their jail populations that result in overcrowding positions that are no longer due being reallocated to jails that still don't fully have the staffing they need for their crowded positions. Yes?
As that fixes, my jail has 30 of those positions, those emergency positions. As that money comes back, is there a process where the comp board can, if they pull the emergency positions back because of the inmates, population declining, is there a way for some of these sheriff's offices that get no support from their localities to try to get some of that money and have court bailiffs or road deputies? Is there a way to, can the
Right.
court develop a process to where we can start getting some of those positions? If they, you understand what I'm saying? If they're
That's definitely something that we do. So we look at, if the jail population goes down, before we just pull those out, we do look at whether you're due any positions on our standards for court services, and we look at whether you're due any positions on law enforcement. And we move those positions around within the office before we would take them out and reallocate them to another office. So we do look at that.
Is there any way for a sheriff to justify over the formula, like the formula the comp board issue, the formula they use, but if a sheriff doesn't have the capability to even have bailiffs at a metal detector coming in a courthouse, if he is able to show you the need, can that formula be trumped?
Not necessarily, because the formula is spelled out in law. So there are limits to how much we can just maintain them when other jails still have needs for those positions. We can talk about your specific situation, but we definitely look at whether there are permanent correctional officer positions that are needed, whether there are positions that are due under law enforcement or court services, to reclassify those positions if we can before we remove them. The jail overcrowding positions are the only ones that get reallocated from year to year. We do have a reallocation policy for other, for court services, law enforcement, that it's based on attrition, but it's not based on attrition for the emergency corrections positions. And we can talk about that some more.
Thank you.
Yes. But again, one of the other things I would mention about that is, we typically look at 12 months worth of data when we look at the population. For every year for the last couple of years, we've been really careful about looking at the most recent data available. So even for offices that looked like, based on their calendar year 22 population, that their numbers were down, we did pull the first few months of calendar year 23 to make sure that those trends were continuing, or if they were going back up, we reconsidered what we were looking at. So we definitely, it's not my joy to have to tell anybody that we're taking positions. We definitely try to make sure that we've covered all the bases before we do that. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is career development program funding for sheriff's offices. So there were, last year, we have new individuals, newly qualifying, newly eligible to come into the program every year. Last year there were 11 there were 11 sheriffs that were eligible to participate in the career development program and get the funding stipend that goes along with that, but we only had sufficient funding for 7 of them, and so there were 4 last year that got put on a wait list that we sought funding for over the course of the budget development cycle. So of those 4, 3 of them still qualify, and they will be funded in fiscal year '24 using attrition savings from some individuals that have left the program. So generally speaking, getting back to where we are with the budget, there was funding in the governor's budget for the additional funds that we needed for the career development program, but because none of that has been approved yet, we're working only off of existing funding. So for fiscal year '24, there were 5 new sheriffs that came into the program, became eligible for the program. So we're bringing in 3 from last year and 2 of the 5, and then we have additional funding. We need to seek additional funding for 3. However, going back to what's going on with the budget, if the legislature does come back and approve additions to the budget that were included by the governor, then those offices would be funded. So we can, if anybody knows that they asked for that this year, we could talk about that a little bit more after as well. But these are really the only things that are in the existing budget that we're working with right now in developing your budget for next year, or approving your budget rather for next year. So this would be a good time to talk about what comes next. I mentioned, obviously, that the legislature approved the skinny budget, that the budget negotiators have said that they're committed to continuing to do that. But again, we had to go ahead and approve a budget because we actually had a budget. So we've gone through the process of the budget estimates, the budget hearing, a budget board meeting. And so we have a deadline of May 1st to set budgets. That's largely been done. Budgets will be available to you on Monday. However, again, as we talked about, the legislature continuing to look at the budget, there's no timeline by which this has to be done because the budget is done, right? So there's really no timeline. And I don't have any particular insights, anything beyond what I'm reading in the paper or what you all are reading in the paper. So it looks like, based on what I've seen in the news, that we're looking at the possibility of late June, which means we will probably get to July 1 or very close to July 1 before we could approve an amended budget, depending upon what the legislature decides to do. They could go beyond July 1. Again, we have a budget, so there's no real set timeline for when they could do this. It could happen earlier, it could happen later. I guess realistically, it could happen not at all. But we do think that there is work being done. And so once they make a decision, we will go through our process again, we'll amend budgets, and we'll get that information out to you. However, we'll be poised to take action. We'll be working over the next couple of months to go through all of the proposals and make sure that we're prepared to allocate those funds should they come forward. So there were 4 funding initiatives. So I want to talk about those a little bit so that you all know kind of what's in the pipeline, as they say, what we think potentially could come forward. So there were 4 funding initiatives for sheriff's offices impacting salaries that were under consideration by the legislature. 2 of those items were included by the governor when he introduced his budget last December. And neither of these items was removed by the House or Senate when they created their amendments to that budget bill that the governor had introduced. So one of those items was significant funding that would further adjust the minimum salaries for ranked and tenured deputies above the amounts that were provided last year to increase the entry-level salary of a new deputy last year. So as you all know, when we went through that process to increase the minimum salary for an entry-level deputy up to $42,000, there was a lot of compression created amongst your ranked and tenured deputies with regard to comp board salaries that was not remedied by the additional compression increase that was provided on top of that. So the second item included in the governor's budget was that career development funding. So again, that's still out there as a possibility. And then 2 additional funding items were proposed related to salaries by the House and the Senate. Both the House and the Senate had proposed increasing the 5% across the board increase to 7%. And then a House Appropriations Committee amendment, which was requested by the Virginia Sheriff's Association, would consolidate the population-based salary groups for the lower population serving sheriffs. So for sheriff's offices that were serving populations of less than 40,000, those population groups were all consolidated and under the proposal, those population groups would all be consolidated into a 0 to 70,000 population salary level that would be set at the current salary of sheriffs that serve 40,000 to 70,000. So those with under 40,000 would be moved up, and everyone under 70,000 would be in the same population bracket. Again, that one was proposed by the House. It wasn't on both sides, so it is subject to negotiation between those two chambers. So again, these are the 4 items related to salary funding that I would expect to still be under consideration and negotiation. But again, because we're talking about a brand-new budget bill, if they come to agreement, there really could be anything in there. Any of these items could be subject to change, excluded. They could add additional items, et cetera, because we're talking about a completely new budget. But my expectation, of course, and John could probably weigh in on that too, is that they're probably looking at those items that they were considering back in February. So I do want to take a minute to kind of give you some details about that ranked and tenured increase. And you probably can't see this. Maybe you all can see this. And I'll get this out to you all as well. But just to kind of illustrate to you kind of what we're looking at and what was planned in this proposal. So the way that our salary structure is, last year before the increase, we had an entry-level salary of $35,149 for entry-level grade 7 deputies. And then after a year, those individuals go up 9.3%. After a year, those individuals go up 4.56% when they become a grade 8 deputy. So that salary was $36,752, and then to go up to a master deputy, which was a 9.3%, took them to $41,174. And then grades 9 through 11 had an entry level of $38,415, and grades 12 through 14 had an entry level of $51,062. So what happened last year in August was the entry level went to 42, but then on top of that, there was either a 2.5% increase or a 5% increase across the board, depending upon how big the increase was for the particular individual from 35 to 42. And so what that meant was that the new minimum salary for everyone up through a grade 11 is now $43,050, which is essentially 2.5% above 2.5% above that 42. And so there were compression-based increases that were provided on top of that, $100 per year of service between 3 and 30 years of service. But it really wasn't enough to address that massive compression that happened when everyone who had a salary below 42 went to 42, and then they either got 2.5% or 5% on top of that. So you can see that the salary structure under that fiscal year 23 current minimum salary column is pretty compressed. And so what was included in the governor's budget was a proposal to try to remedy that. So under the proposal, your grade 8s, which are your people who have been there for a year, would go up from 42 to 43,915, which is 4.56% above the 42,000. And the reason why this is really important is because your people who were already grade 8s only went up to 43,050, but your people who maybe met that 1-year threshold after August 1 of last year went to 43,915, so you potentially had people who had been there less time making more money on the comp board side. I realize some of you, I encouraged you all last year to really work with your localities to shift those local funds to make those differentials, but we obviously want to have that on our side. The proposal would raise, so it would take 8s to 43,915, so anybody that wasn't at that level would at least go to that level. Master deputies would be 9.3% above that at just shy of 48,000. That would be the same level for your grades 9 through 11, and then your grades 12 would go up to 56,059. And so we felt like this was really important to try to put those differentials back into place. When they did the increases last year for sheriff's deputies, everybody went to 42, and then there was a compression increase. But on the DOC side, they all went to 42, but then they had increases at their ranked levels that we didn't have for sheriffs. So we're trying to get that remedied here. And then essentially you can see how many positions that we allocate that this will actually impact, right? So at the grade 7 level, it obviously isn't going to impact the minimum level, but there were 2,300, which is about 53% of your grade 8s that it would impact. For your master deputies, 88% of those ended up coming in below what the master deputy amount really should be. And then for your 9s through your 14s, your ranked deputies, 64% of those would also be impacted. And so, you can see the funding levels for that. And then after that, on the far right, is then what the new minimums would be after the 5% on July 1, because both of these raises were to go into effect at the same time. Right, so you can see what the new levels would have been. They would have been potentially even higher if a 7% had been approved. Now, this is all going to have to change a little bit because obviously right now we're just moving forward with 5%. If this proposal that was in the governor's budget gets approved by the budget negotiators, we should end up in that far column as far as what the salaries will be. Again, I don't know what the legislature will do. I'm hopeful that they are considering all of the items that were in the budget bill to start with. But again, I won't know probably any sooner than you do whether or not any of this is going to go forward. But I wanted you all to have an illustration of what this looked like, because I know we had talked about increases for ranked and tenured, but I'm not sure you really knew what that looked like. So we can send this out so you all can see it. Again, right now it's kind of up in the air, but I think it was a really good initiative in the governor's budget to get this money moving forward to adjust those comp board salaries for your ranked and tenured folks. And then at the bottom, there's kind of a reference to the compression-based increase. So, and what I would say about that is, you think about how the money would flow, right? We gave up to 42,000, and then we went up 5% or 2.5%. And then there was a compression increase on top of that that was $100 per year of service. So to create some differentiation between your folks at the varying levels. So if we go to these new salary bases and we bring everybody up to that point, you're going to have compression again, right? So in addition to those increases, we're going to put that same compression increase back on top of it. So if somebody had 10 years of service and they got $1,000 for that, we're going to add that $1,000 on top. So essentially, by the compression already being in there, the cost of doing this was less, right? But we want to put it back on so that you still have that compression-based differential. So I hope I haven't confused anybody, but I did want to kind of explain a little bit about how this will work if it goes forward. I think it's really important, and I really hope it goes forward. We worked pretty hard on this. So I wanted you all to have those details. So kind of back to, and again, this is kind of where we are with the budget, hoping that these things will go forward. Hope we'll know something. We may not know anything until the end of June. So beyond the salary initiatives that we talked about, there were a couple of other initiatives that were included in the governor's budget, or one other item that was in the governor's budget when it was introduced that is also not in the skinny budget. And that is that the governor had proposed funding of $4 million for sheriff's offices to provide up to 71 deputy sheriff and regional jail positions, as well as some part-time funding to assist with staffing costs for court-ordered transportation, for ECOs and TDOs. Now, the allocation of the positions and the funding and the part-time funding would depend on really the number and the magnitude of the transports that you're doing in your locality. So it wouldn't be enough for a position for every office, but there would also be part-time funding available for those offices that weren't getting a full-time position. So the Senate has a proposal in, or had a proposal in, that would move those funds to Department of Behavioral Health and Disability Services, Developmental Services, for them to put into an expansion of their off-duty officer program, which is a separate program they're providing to help in some jurisdictions with the transportation. So the House has it in the comp board with positions and funding for your offices. The Senate has it going to DBHDS for their off-duty officer program. that's obviously an item up for negotiation, and we'll have to see what happens with that when the legislature finishes their work. Also, a Senate amendment. There was an amendment just on the Senate side that would provide an increase in the inmate per diem rate for local responsible inmates. Those of you who have been around for a while know that back when we went through budget reductions in 2010 to 2012, that per diem rate reduction for local responsible inmates dropped from $8 a day to $4 a day. The Senate has proposed increasing it back to $6 a day. It was originally planned to be implemented with inmates in your facility in June, which means it would affect the second quarter per diem payment. Again, we'll need a little bit of time to get that done if they approve it. So I'm not sure exactly what the timeline would be, but again, that's an item for negotiation because it was only on one side of the legislature. So, and just talking about timelines in general, all of the salary initiatives that we talked about were originally in the budget with an effective date of July 1st. That would obviously be very difficult if no decisions are made until, the third week of June or later. The comp board has processes that it has to go through by law before amending the budget or setting the budget and communicating with you all. And of course, your local governments, once we increase your budget, then the local government has to appropriate those funds, and they have their local appropriations processes that require their, city council, board of supervisors, et cetera. So, it would be unrealistic, I think, to have these things effective July 1. That doesn't mean that the legislature couldn't say, no, everything's effective July 1, but my anticipation would be that whatever is approved, we're probably looking at a delayed implementation. Again, whatever they approve, we'll send out notifications and we'll let you all know what's going on as soon as we know anything. So I've talked about the budget a lot just from the perspective of, what came from the governor's budget bill, what went through the legislature, kind of where we are. But I want to close that loop and talk a little bit about kind of the rest of the budget process. I mean, we've talked about this before. The governor puts his budget in, it goes through the legislative process. We do budget estimates, we do a budget hearing, our board sets budgets, we get them out to you by May 1. But I don't know that we've ever really talked about the rest of the picture and kind of what the comp board does to advocate for you on its end. So once the board sets your budget for the upcoming year, hopefully on May 1st, sometimes as late as close to July 1st when there are legislative delays, then our staff moves on and we're developing proposals for the next cycle. So this is when our budget process actually begins, which is in the summer of every year. There are some technical aspects to the work that we do. So we work through the summer, and essentially what will happen this summer is we're already going to start building the budget for the next 2 years. So, the cycles by which the governor has to introduce funding proposals are kind of wonky with their term, right? But so this next budget cycle is going to be significant for the governor because this will be his opportunity to present a full 2-year budget under his term of office. And so everyone in state government is working from May through the summer or from June through the summer to develop a new base for the next 2 years, to make some technical changes, annualizing things that are transparent to you, but do take a little bit of work on our part. But the most important part of what we do is what's called budget decision packages. And those are our opportunity to go to the administration and make your needs known. So this is where we look at our staffing standards for things like law enforcement positions, court services positions, overcrowding positions if we need them, other funding priorities that we work with your association on identifying and quantifying all of that and sending it through to our cabinet secretary, which is the Secretary of Administration. They work with the Secretary of Finance to come up with the governor's priorities. And so the governor has to kind of prioritize everything that's coming in from all agencies along with his own priorities for what he wants to get done and decide what can be funded. But again, our opportunity to make your needs known is through those decision packages, and we spend a lot of time on that in the fall. So just so that you kind of, have a general idea, on a routine basis, we make requests every year for positions that are due for law enforcement. Law enforcement deputy sheriffs, at this time are funded based upon the statute, which says that there is one law enforcement deputy sheriff allocated for every 1,500 population that office is serving, where the sheriff provides primary law enforcement. Up until 2008, those positions were diligently funded every single year. When we hit the revenue shortfalls and recession of the 2010 to 2012 time period, those positions were not funded, and we've made the request every single year in the fall, and they haven't been funded since 2008. This is generally our number one priority in our budget requests every year. So there's currently a need for over 200 of these positions statewide due to population growth over that period of time. And these positions have not been funded. And so again, they were routinely funded for a long time. It has, once we came out of recession, all of a sudden that priority had to be in line with every other priority in the Commonwealth, and it just hasn't been funded. Again, I don't want to say nothing's been done, right? Because this is a really good proposal, and a lot of work has been done on salaries. And there are a lot of different competing priorities, obviously, that are not my decision to make. But we've included funds, we've included requests for those law enforcement positions every year. We also routinely make requests for the other staffing standards, whether it's the deputies needed for court services, whether it's the positions for jail overcrowding when we needed it. And also, there are a number of positions out there that were defunded in that 2010 to 2012 time period, and we've been routinely asking for those positions to be restored as well. And just, kind of understand, we can't just put that money out there. We also, every year, request funding for the career development program as it's needed. So there are a number of other items that we include each year in our requests for your offices, for the other constitutional offices, of course, because we represent all of you. But we do work with the administration to identify those cost proposals. And also, the administration has ideas of its own that we also work with them to quantify and identify costs to provide those scenarios. So I just want to, kind of a Comp Board 101 thing, something that we talk about with new officers when they're elected, is kind of the compensation board's role. And that is, we are an executive branch agency. So when the governor ultimately decides what is going to be included in his budget, then as an executive branch agency, we support that budget. The spring, the summer and the fall, that's our time to essentially lobby the governor's office to get you all what you need in that respect. I knew you all within your associations also lobby folks in the governor's office to try to get the things that you need into the budget. But again, once those decisions are made as an executive branch agency, it's our role to support that budget, and we cannot lobby the General Assembly. Our role as a state agency, we go and we talk about technical aspects of bills. We don't generally give a position on bills. We can, one of the things that we do is we work really closely with all of the constitutional officer associations on providing technical assistance to get you all the information you need so that you can effectively lobby your General Assembly members. But we can't go to the General Assembly and lobby for the things that you need, no matter how much we might want to. We do talk also with legislative staff, so we provide a lot of technical information and support to legislative staff. But your role through your association is the lobbying of the legislature. Our role is to do that up front. Once the budget is final, after the legislative session adjourns, we've already talked about those steps, but it's important to understand also our role in setting the budgets for your offices. So the board is responsible for having policies in place like staffing standards that use objective criteria to allocate positions. And we're responsible for using those policies and those objective criteria to distribute the money that we have. So some of you have been around for a long time, and you remember my predecessor. And he had a saying, and those of you who have been around for a long time will remember it. He said it a lot, and people got tired of hearing it, so when he retired, I was asked to retire the saying. But for those of you that are new, it's a really good analogy And I'll just say it once, and that is that the compensation board is not the pie maker, we're the pie cutter, right? We have no ability to make the pie, other than the process through the administrative offices that we talked about. Our role is to cut that pie as fairly as we can. That's the only time I'll say it, but it is a great analogy, and maybe the new people in the room need to hear it. So again, we do our best to make your needs known through that administrative process and work with you during the legislative session. But we simply cannot, by law, set a budget for your office that exceeds the funds that were appropriated, no matter how much we might want to, or no matter how much we know you all need those funds. But we do work with you all to get that done. So a lot of budget talk this morning. Hopefully you all had your coffee. I try not to throw too many numbers at you, but it is still kind of early. But again, a lot of stuff is still in flux. I'm really hopeful that a lot of what we talked about will come forward. You know, it's a lot more work for us to allocate it, but I'd much rather be able to do that than not. It's, you know, money that we really want to get to your offices. And so I just want to mention one other thing. Not sure where we are on time. I'm a little early, but so I do want to mention one other thing. So, and this is completely changing the subject. Behind the scenes for the last year or so, we've been working on transitioning our coin budgeting and reimbursement system. And now, before anybody gets too excited, you're not going to see any major changes right now. But the system is moving from a mainframe platform to a network cloud-based platform. It's going to look the same at first. We're doing this, you know, we would have preferred to redo the entire system, but we had a pretty tight timeline that the state is requiring all state agencies to get off the mainframe system. So we had kind of a short window to get that done, so we're doing what's called a refactor, and that's where essentially the mainframe programming language is converted to a more modern network-based programming language, and the database structure that's in the mainframe will be converted to a more modern database, you know, SQL Server system. That's a word you've probably heard. So again, it'll be transparent to you because it's literally just translating, converting all of the code to the new system. It's going to look the same at first. But what we're excited about with this process is that it's going to be a more modern technology, which means we'll actually be able to find people to hire and work on it. So it'll give us more opportunities, you know, where it's not been agile. We'll have some opportunities to make some changes over time that kind of improve the way that it functions. And we're really looking forward to that, even though you won't really notice anything at first.